Timothy, hi.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for inviting me to your house, to
Yeah.
your cozy, very comfortable place. I really want to thank you for your very active in media and expertise pro-Ukrainian position. Pro-Ukrainian, it means objective position. So you're so active as an expert, explaining the current situation in the West, explaining the current situation in Ukraine. However, I have some very pragmatic and practical questions concerning the economical situation. As a political analyst, I don't see that the conflict will stop tomorrow or next year. Unfortunately, I see this conflict in the long-term perspective.
Yeah.
So what are the consequences for the Ukraine? How we have to handle with all these problems which war can cause for my country? And I think that one of the aim of Russians is also destroy the economy of my country. What we have to do?
Well, I mean, one interesting, I think, aspect of the war so far has been the durability of the Ukrainian economy, right? I mean, the fact that banks work, telecom system works, mobile phones, transport infrastructure, people get paid, which is still. But I think a lot of that is due to Ukrainians, their innovation. They're remarkable in terms of what they've achieved. But in the reality, it's also been Western financing. I mean, huge numbers. I mean, the West's providing probably $35-40 billion a year now of fiscal support. And I mean, you raised the question about, the durability of that. I mean, what would happen to the Ukrainian economy if that stopped? And the reality probably would be massive budget deficits, monetary financing, central bank financing of the deficit, which is inflationary, pressure on the exchange rate. So without that Western support, I think the macro would probably collapse. I mean, that's the reality. And that would present a very challenging situation for Ukraine, but I'd say also for Europe. So one of the reasons I would argue that Western financial support for Ukraine has to continue is not only to ensure Ukraine's military success, or it wins back its territory or it stops Russia, but actually to stop the destabilization of the Ukrainian economy, which could actually have the same effect in terms of allowing Russia to win, but also, you'd see huge further out migration of Ukrainians, which I'd say would be destabilizing for Europe. So I don't see an option for Europe in terms of we have to support Ukraine both from a military perspective, but also from a macro financial perspective. Otherwise, I think Ukraine will end up as a failed state, macro instability, social, political instability, and huge outmigration, which is bad for Europe.
Concerning the Western support of my country, economical support, we see that there are different sources of this support: the American support, the British support, the European Union support. How this support will be stable in these circumstances, possible political destabilization? We see what happened now in Slovakia, in Poland. We see what's happening inside the American politics. How we can avoid these risks?
Well, you're right. I mean, I guess the unity of the West is being questioned, being challenged. The problems in the US Congress, difficulties in the Republican Party, US elections coming up, Trump, obviously Trump said he wouldn't support Ukraine. And also Europe. I mean, obviously you mentioned Slovakia, obviously Orban in Hungary has been critical. I mean, two different things. I mean, firstly, it's easy for Trump to say, I will stop support for Ukraine, presumably if he wins in November 24, and then if he takes power in, I think January, February 25. But what does that mean? What does it mean if the US stops supporting Ukraine financially and militarily? I mean, I just think the Ukrainians will not stop fighting. They still face the same threat. Russia has to take Ukraine and keep Ukraine. I mean, if Trump says it's yours, it's not that easy. I mean, he has to go in. We saw obviously February 22, his attempt for a full-scale invasion, it failed. I'm not sure Russia really has the military capability to do that quickly. At least I think it will take a lot of time. But if that happens, and let's say he is able to take it quickly, that will present a huge military threat to Europe, NATO, And I said also financially. I mean, Ukrainians will not stay.
Mm-hmm.
There will be huge out-migration. So I think that the reality is that even a Trump and Republican next administration would find it very difficult to pull the plug completely on support for Ukraine in 2025, right?
For example.
Because it would present a Russian victory, a Chinese victory, signaling about what it says about US strength globally, signaling to China about Taiwan. So I'm not sure that will necessarily happen. In the near term, obviously, there are question marks about financing. There's the new speaker in the House. There's talk about this, obviously, this big bill with Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, border security, attempts to break off the Israel bit of it. I still think that there's an absolute majority in the Congress for support of Ukraine. It may be complicated and messy getting there, but I don't think they're going to pull that. I think there'll still be enough financial support to get through to the next US presidential election. And after that, as I said, I think it's debatable actually whether Trump will be willing to pull the plug. And irrespective of that, it's difficult to see Russia assuming total victory in Ukraine. On Europe, I mean, I think that the harsh reality is no one expected this level of unity anyway. I think if you'd have gone to late 21,
it wasn't possible.
No one would have imagined the level of sanctions. No one would have imagined that Europe would have been writing a check for 50 billion for the period from 24 to 27. They've probably written checks for about that number already. I mean, they're huge numbers. And there has been unity, and Orban in Hungary has not been able to block Western financing or EU financing and Western military support for Ukraine. He's very vocal, but he's also reliant on Western bailouts, Western finance. About 23 billion euros of EU money goes to Hungary in the period to 27. So if he plays hardball, he loses that money. So look, and I think ultimately, Europe realizes that if they stop funding Ukraine, Putin wins, Putin takes Ukraine. Again, it may take some time. What does that mean? That means, Russia back on NATO's borders. It means a massive increase in defense spending. I mean, forget about 2% of GDP, NATO defense spending. They'll have to spend 3% of GDP. We'll have to go back to where we were in the 1980s in terms of level. So it means more defense spending. It means having to cope with probably an unstable Ukraine, politically, socially, economically, having to cope with migrants. So I don't know. I think in the end, Europe has no choice but to support Ukraine. And obviously the hope is that Ukrainians are able to deliver victory sooner rather than later. So, I'm still relatively optimistic about Western support for Ukraine enduring because we have no choice.
You're right.
If we don't support Ukraine, Putin wins. And that is a huge security threat for the rest of Europe. I don't think Putin stops in Ukraine. And actually interesting, I mean, you're in the UK. I mean, what's interesting here is there is cross-party support from Labour, from the Conservatives. Labour's probably going to win the next election. I don't see any change in UK government policy towards Russia and Ukraine. The public in the UK, I mean, it's solid. It's rock solid. You rarely hear any support for Russia in the media, in public. You go around the UK, you go to little villages in the middle of nowhere, and there's a Ukrainian flag hoisted. I think people get it. This is about bullying. It's about Russia as a terrorist state, Putin as a fascist dictatorship. I think people understand that, and I think they understand. If we fail to support Ukraine, who's next?
Exactly. I made an interview with Professor Brendan Sims in Cambridge, in the Center of Geopolitics, and he said two very important things, which actually confirms with what I was saying, that when Boris Johnson came to Ukraine in April last year, I mean, if we don't take into account the attitude of the local population to Boris Johnson, to his figure, just think about his as a politician which came to support Ukraine, he reflected the general opinion of the British society, if we speak about support of Ukraine. And also Brendan Sims said that this war, this is a challenge for the Western order, challenge. And I think that you are right when you speak about the importance of support of Ukraine by the Western countries. However, we see what's happening in the other hemisphere of the world. I visited Iran, I visited China many times, and I saw many times how integrated the economy, for example, of Iran and Turkey, how integrated the economy of China and Russian Federation. But I think that this so-called ally between these countries, which we see now in North Korea, is very, very artificial. So to some extent, it helps Russia avoid the Western sanctions. What do you see the impact of these sanctions on Russian economy, and what that Putin's regime can do to avoid the economical impact? Because I see that now we don't see huge impact of the Western sanctions on Russian economy, at least politically maybe, yeah? But in the long-term perspective, what we will see, do Chinese, Russia, Iran, and North Korea and other countries could they create some kind of new, economical bloc?
Well, look, sanctions are a difficult business, right? There are many sanctioned countries. You mentioned Iran, there's Venezuela, North Korea. They're not a silver bullet, right? Economies continue to function, like the Ukrainian economy has continued to function in total war, right? There will always be economic activity, right? And countries try and get around sanctions. That's the reality. And, I think we've always got to think about, in the end, we want to hurt Russia. We want to undermine its ability to sustain the war. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the damage globally is limited. And, because we need to maintain the unity of the coalition, there is the global south to think about, obviously their political backing. So there are kind of limits. I think we've kind of realized that. But I think what's possibly changed, and it's you mentioned a long war, whatever happens in Ukraine, I think Putin's aggression and invasion of Ukraine and aggression has shown to the West that there's no going back to business as usual with Russia. As long as Putin is in power, Russia is going to be a threat to us, our system of Western liberal market democracy, and we have to weaken the Russian economy over the longer term. So I don't see any quick lifting of sanctions. We have an interest now in weakening Russia. So sanctions will remain in place for a long time. We'll have to continuously think about how we adjust to counter Russia's trying to get round the sanctions. And we have to try and think of ways to make them more effective. I mean, one idea, there's a lot of focus on dual-use electronics goods, right? And if you look at the missiles that are raining down on Ukraine, and you take them apart, there's a lot of Western components. I think maybe we need to be a bit more radical. I mean, one really interesting idea, there's a guy called Nigel Gould-Davis, a former diplomat, has raised this issue of like a sanctions zero policy. So the idea is, you set a date 2 years down the line, and you tell international business that we're going to zero trade with Russia. Zero. Nothing. No trade will be allowed. But you have the next couple of years to get specific licenses. You have to prove why it's in our interest to do trade with Russia. So it makes people think. It'll make people think, well, ultimately, if we're heading to a situation where there's much reduced trade with Russia, actually, we don't really want to trade and invest in Russia. We will reduce our activity. But it makes those companies that have products they're selling with potential dual use, it makes them really have to work hard to get the licenses to continue to be able to supply Russia. So it will definitely reduce the availability of those products that fuel the Russian war machine. I'm not saying in reality we go to zero trade with Russia. It just makes it much more difficult to trade with Russia. And I think it won't be as disruptive because companies we're given like a 2-year period to think about, about getting the licenses. So I think that's the next step, possibly. Another one, which, linking the two of this idea of how do we economically support Ukraine and how do we hurt Russia? I mean, look, if there are serious question marks about financing Ukraine's victory and its recovery, if we really think that Western taxpayers are not politically in the right place to continue to fund Ukraine, then actually our governments have to provide alternatives, right? This project, I would argue, Ukraine's victory and successful reconstruction is the most important strategic project for the West since the collapse of communism.
Timothy, this is my actually next and last question concerning...
Well, can I finish? Can I just finish this point?
Yeah.
It's the most important project, I would say, in our defense. So we have to fund it. If taxpayers are not going to fund it, how are you going to do it? The only solution is using frozen Russian assets between $300 and $400 billion. That will absolutely fund Ukraine's victory and successful reconstruction. And, it will send a very strong message to Russia that not only are the assets immobilized or frozen, but they're getting taken away. And it sends a very strong message to other regimes globally that if you are a global bad actor, if you're going to invade another country, conduct wars, crimes and genocide, you will suffer a financial cost from it. Your assets will be taken away. So I think this is really important. At the moment, our governments are kind of pretending. They're kind of pretending that there is money available and politically get it over the line. I would say, well, let's not mess around here. Let's change whatever legislation we need to change to use those frozen assets to ensure Ukraine's victory.
This was actually my last question concerning the future. And you have already mentioned very important things concerning the restoration, recovery, concerning the support of Ukraine in the future. How you see the architecture, I would say, of this recovery? It's a very complex question, the assets of Russia. But I'm a lawyer in the past. Yeah, I'm a practice lawyer. I know how difficult to do it quickly. I mean, to take the money, Russian money, for example, from Canada, from United States, from Austria, from Switzerland, and to use them for recovery of Ukraine. What kind of examples can you show, and just to say after the Second World War, which can be suitable for Ukrainian situation? Because in Japan there was one program. It was so-called Marshall support for Europe. It was recovery of Kuwait after Saddam Hussein invasion, but it was mostly made by Americans, by Saudi Arabia. Who should play the leading role in the future recovery of Ukraine? United States, European, or it should be some kind of unity, some kind of general foundation for support of Ukraine? How you see it actually as a practical person?
Yeah, look, I think we need to go back to basics, right? And I think the message is not really getting through. And go back to this idea that this is the most important project since the collapse of communism, right? I mean, some of your listeners may well remember that we had various support programs for
Poland.
Well, we had FAR program for Hungary, Poland, Central Europe. We had TASIS for the former Soviet Union. There was a big commitment, right? A lot of money went into kind of helping the transition from plan to market, right? We even had the creation of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. This project was so important, this transition from plan to market, that we created a multilateral development bank specifically for it, right? I think this project is as important, right? And we need to think, and I don't think, we need to think how we're going to fund it long term, and we need to think about the institutional structure around this recovery and reconstruction. And I don't think really there's enough thought seriously about it. I don't think there's a great deal of coordination. The Americans are doing their thing, the Europeans are doing their thing. I think we need a financial Rammstein. I mean, on the military front, they meet every month and they talk about what missiles. I mean, actually, we need something similar, a global coordination between Western countries to lead this recovery and reconstruction. And I think it's so important that we actually need a Western Ukrainian institution that manages it. I don't think it's the right project for EBRD. They have shareholders, including Russia. non-Western shareholders, they have a different mandate. They have a much bigger mandate. I think this project is important enough that we have a specific agency, the Ukraine's reconstruction, that's a partnership between Western countries and Ukraine. It provides it does the planning, the programming. It can be a partner for investors. It can be, it should be able to raise money on its own behalf. But the fact is that a lot of Western money is being put into Ukraine, right? Obviously, Ukraine has a bad history around corruption, rule of law, those kind of issues. And there's a lot of focus on the private sector getting involved in Ukraine's reconstruction. Unless there's fundamental trust in this process, recovery and reconstruction, and there's a right institutional setting around it, I don't think the private sector will actually step up and get involved in Ukraine. So I think we need to think about this, and we're not thinking about it at the moment. And I think that's a major weakness for me. How we fund it and the institutional setup around Ukraine recovery.